What's up, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Drue Crime. I'm your host, Drue V, and for these next two episodes, I will be covering the unbelievable and very questionable case of 21-year-old Lauren Agee. In late July of 2015, Lauren had decided to attend a weekend event called Wakefest at Center Hill Lake in DeKalb County, Tennessee. Wakefest is a big wakeboard festival that included an estimate of around 600 boats and a couple thousand people who attended that year. This event is one of the biggest in the Southeast, and it's been said by many people that it's really just one giant party. So on Friday afternoon, Lauren and her childhood friend at the time, Hannah Palmer, drove together 2 hours from their hometown in Hendersonville, Tennessee, to the Wakefest event. The girls were to meet up and camp with Hannah's then boyfriend and now husband, Aaron Lilly, along with a friend of his, Chris Stout. Lauren and her mother were under the impression she would be staying in a cabin that night, but when Lauren arrived at Wakefest, the campsite was anything but that. In fact, their campsite consisted of a couple tents and a couple hammocks high close to a cliffside. The cliff was slanted, covered with trees, brush, with many jagged rocks below. Lauren only planned on staying at Wakefest for just one night, and then she planned on returning home the next day on Saturday so she could attend her then boyfriend's party he was hosting at his place. But as the weekend festivities rolled on, Lauren's plans would change and she would end up staying at Wakefest for one more night. As the following morning approached on Sunday, Lauren's parents had still not heard from her, and after numerous attempts to reach her with no response, they really began to start worrying. Lauren's mother, Sherry Smith, and her stepdad, Michael Smith, had decided that something just didn't feel right about Lauren's absence, knowing she was supposed to be home around 6 p.m. Saturday night. So the Smiths then decided they would drive up to the lake to check on her, but before they could even leave their house, there was a knock at their door. And once they opened the front door, everything they had already been worrying about would start to become a very horrifying reality. So after Sherry and Mike were then notified by two police officers at their home that an accident involving Lauren had occurred, they both got in the car and literally hauled ass to where Lauren was, which was no longer at Wakefest, but now at the DeKalb County Hospital. Once Mike and Sherry would arrive at the hospital, they were put in a room where they would await some type of information about Lauren's status, and next is when they would then be approached by a DeKalb County sheriff and lead detective in this case, Jeremy Taylor. And Taylor had nothing but devastating news about their daughter. Taylor would then go on to inform the Smiths that Lauren did not make it, and Lauren's death was the result of some kind of accident. And this would be just the beginning to a very appalling and almost non-existent death investigation into Lauren Agee. Lauren's body had been discovered Sunday afternoon face down in the water in a nearby cove, which was close by to where she and other campers were camping during Wakefest. But no one really seemed to know how Lauren's body got there, and the other campers she had been staying with that weekend, well, their original story from that night would start to change. As this case and story unfolds, we learn that Lauren's death was caused by blunt force trauma to the back of the head, with the possibility of drowning. And it was also said later on in this story that this may have occurred by her falling off the cliffside that their campsite was right next to, while trying to use the restroom in the middle of the night. And again, Lauren Agee's death would be ruled as an accident by Detective Jeremy Taylor, and Taylor was able to make this decision in a matter of minutes. So before Lauren's death was ruled an accident, many people, including other law enforcement that were present at the scene when her body was discovered, started to realize that these other so-called friends' stories weren't really adding up, and their behavior seemed anything but normal. The death investigation into Lauren's case will leave you speechless, angry, and pretty much any other negative emotion you're able to feel. The DeKalb Sheriff Department didn't even investigate this case properly. They blackballed Lauren's family the entire time, and by the end of the episode, you will understand what terrible policing and investigating truly looks like. So please, continue to join me on this wild case as I discuss in this Part 1 episode who Lauren Agee was. Then I would like to get right into her story and really close in on other campers she was with that weekend. I will also be discussing the DeKalb County sheriffs that botched this case from the get-go and their almost non-existent investigation into Lauren's death. Then in Part 2, I will talk about a mysterious fifth person that was at their campsite that weekend, which wouldn't be revealed until much later on, and in my opinion, this becomes the most important revelation in this case up to this point in time. And as always, I'd like to share my thoughts and opinions on this case, and then I'll finish the next episode trying to narrow everything down and give my best speculated theory surrounding Lauren's death. This is True Crime, Episode 8, Lauren Agee, Part 1.
And local law enforcement wanted to make it seem like I'm some kind of menace to society, and I ran after killing Kiara Barron knowing that authority was on the way to kill my own children.
Did I read that right?
You certainly did, yes, sir.
Did I read that right?
You did.
Did I read that right?
You continue to read them right, yes.
And you were drinking pretty heavily.
Were you there?
"12 days ago, your attorneys messed up. They sent you an entire digital copy of your entire cell phone with every text message you've sent for the past 2 years.
Alright, now I just wanted to take a quick moment to talk about where I got most of my information about this case, and it comes from an amazing deep dive podcast into this case called Without Warning by Sheila Wysocki. Sheila and her team did a great job in dissecting this case, including real interviews and depositions that were done along the way. I recommend this podcast to anyone who is really interested in Lauren's case, and I myself have listened to hours of audio completing every episode Sheila has provided about Lauren's story. The depositions of DeKalb County Sheriff Patrick Ray and Detective Jeremy Taylor alone will blow your mind, and I will have the links to these depositions listed in the episode description box. A lot of the inserted audio you'll hear in the episode is from some of the interviews conducted by Sheila and her team. Also, there is a ton of information about this case, so I'm going to try and get to most of it for you in these next 2 parts. One last thing before we begin Lauren's story, this is just a reminder where you can find all of my Drue Crime episodes. I can be found on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Amazon Music, and many more. I can also be found at YouTube at www.youtube.com/@DrueCrime, where I post some video presentations of the podcast episodes I publish. So if my channel is something that interests you, please subscribe and feel free to comment on any of the cases I cover. If anyone wants to discuss a case or may have any questions relating to one of my episodes, I can be contacted through Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, or my personal email at druecrimepodcast@gmail.com. Now, with everything that was just said, let's get right into the mystifying death of Lauren Agee. 21-year-old Lauren Taylor Agee was born on August 19, 1993 in Biloxi, Mississippi, before moving to Hendersonville, Tennessee later on. Lauren's parents were divorced at an early age, and her dad's name is Brian Agee, who called Lauren by the name of Taylor, and her mother's name is Sherry Smith, who was later remarried to Lauren's stepdad Michael Smith, who had known Lauren since she was 3.5 years old. Her family said that Lauren's passions were music, dancing, and according to her obituary, she was full of sugar and a little bit of spice. She lit up every room she entered with her sweet spirit, infectious energy, enchanting smile, and disarming dimples. Simply put, she was beautiful and hilarious. She loved making those around her laugh and sing and dance, and then laugh some more with her bubbly personality and hysterically quick wit. It goes on to say that Lauren had a huge heart and was always considered by friends to be the quote-unquote bestie. Lauren was spontaneous and followed her dreams, earning a dance scholarship to Bethel University before transferring to Vol State, where she had already been enrolled in CSI classes that fall before her passing. After reading and listening about who Lauren was, in my opinion, it shows she was a pretty awesome girl who was not only strikingly beautiful, but also seemed to offer a lot of love and had a great personality as well. So by the end of this episode, you will also start to understand how difficult it must have been for Lauren's family and friends to accept this awful tragedy of this once cheerful and very promising young lady. Now I'm going to start Lauren's story from her home in Hendersonville, Tennessee on Friday, July 24, 2015. Lauren had been invited to go to Wakefest by another so-called friend at the time, Sam Arnold, and I will briefly be talking about Sam again in the next episode. Well, Lauren was originally planning to ride with Sam and Sam's close friend Cassie Banks to the event, but then the girls realized that they wouldn't have enough room for Lauren on the boat when they would arrive to the lake, so Lauren ended up going and staying with a different group, and this is how Lauren ended up riding to Wakefest with a girl she had grown up with and a close neighbor at the time, Hannah Palmer. Now, Sherry, Lauren's mother, wasn't a really big fan of Lauren going to this event in the first place, and she was also not a big fan of Hannah as well. But in the end, Sherry decided that she was okay with Lauren going, and she knew she would be back the next day on Saturday the 25th. So Lauren and Hannah were about ready to leave Lauren's for Wakefest, and this is when Lauren says her goodbyes to her mom, even going back to give her a second hug before the two girls would take off. Sherry then calls out to Hannah to say hi, but for some reason Hannah didn't even acknowledge Sherry in the slightest. There was no response, no wave, not even a look back from Hannah, which made Sherry start to feel a little uneasy. So the girls had Lauren's car and about a 2-hour ride ahead of them to get to Wakefest, and the girls were to meet up with 2 other men who drove separately, Hannah's now husband Aaron Lilly and his buddy Chris Stout. Both girls had already known Aaron previously, and this would be the first time that they had both ever met Chris. Aaron and Chris had arrived at the campsite before the girls that day, and once the girls had arrived, the boys had to take a canoe from their cliffside campsite to the marina docks to pick up the girls. And I will have pictures of the campsite and marina area on the YouTube video so you get a better understanding of what it looks like. Now, before I move on with the story, I just wanted to take a few minutes to briefly talk about the campsite, Aaron Lilly, and Chris Stout. Lauren's group was staying on top of a pretty isolated between 40 to 50 foot high cliffside across the water from all the docks and houseboats in Pate's Ford Marina, which was about 6 to 10 miles south of where the actual Wakefest event was taking place. There was a rope along one side of the cliff that they would use to help them climb up to their campsite, and if they ever went back to the marina docks, they would just use their canoe that they had waiting at the bottom of the cliff. Once they would arrive at the marina dock on the canoe, a couple that they had befriended that weekend with a houseboat would use their lift to get the canoe in and out of the water for them. As for the boys at the campsite, Aaron Lilly, who was 24 at the time of Lauren's death, had already had a few run-ins with the law, being cited for reckless driving, driving without a license, and one night he even crashed a motorcycle with a friend riding on the back, to which Aaron asked a friend to take the fall because if Aaron got any more trouble again, he would have most likely ended up going to jail for 2 years. Aaron was later able to get out of this because no one took a picture of the motorcycle that he had crashed that night, so instead he was able to say in court that it was a dirt bike, and in Tennessee you don't need a license to drive a dirt bike. Therefore, he technically wasn't driving a vehicle without a license. Also, to help Aaron's chances in this particular situation, Aaron's mother signed Aaron's name to a lease in Florida, so it would show that he was moving soon, and I think this was another attempt to help him try and avoid jail time for Aaron, which is exactly what happened after this. Aaron would eventually move to Florida with his wife Hannah Palmer, and I believe that's where they still reside today. One more thing about Aaron had a previous girlfriend by the name of Cassie Banks, who I just spoke of earlier, and she was interviewed by both the Without Warning podcast and by Detective Jeremy Taylor during the course of this case. So after Lauren's death, Taylor spoke with Cassie for more than an hour about Aaron, but for some reason this interview wasn't saved in any files and is still nowhere to be found. The reason I bring up Cassie here is because of what she said about Aaron in the past. She claimed that Aaron was very aggressive and at times became physically abusive towards Cassie, even assaulting her twice in 1 week, with pictures of bruises and bite marks to prove it. Also, it had even got to the point where both her and Aaron had even been arrested one night over a dispute that they had had. And Cassie also mentions that Aaron would throw trash cans at his own emotional support dog, Virginia. So it looks like Aaron certainly has had some issues in the past, and this is in no way an attempt to downplay his character by any means, but rather an attempt to show you what he's capable of doing. Now, as far as Chris Stout, he was just Aaron's buddy that he had invited along that weekend, and Chris had brought his boat along for the event as well. Chris too had his few run-ins with the law, racking up 3 DUIs, which he did end up spending some jail time for. Both of these men play very crucial roles in this case, while both exhibiting some strange behavior along the way, and by the end of this episode, you'll have a much better understanding of who these guys are. Now getting back to our story, Lauren's group had all hung out together on Friday night, and then on Saturday morning the group would wake up, would go back to the marina docks to join the festivities of Wakefest. According to Chris Stout, he said in his deposition that they all decided to go down to the docks to hang out. Then they eventually came back to the campsite for a little bit, before going back to the docks that night, where they would hang out at the marina bar called Fish Lips. After arriving at Fish Lips, everyone started drinking, and then Lauren would end up running into her ex-boyfriend, Clint Martin, who happened to be at the bar with his new girlfriend. And Clint had even said in an interview on the Without Warning podcast that he avoided Lauren and never even spoke to her once that entire weekend, and this actually becomes very important to remember in this case later on. Clint also has a cousin named Evan Shelton that also knew Lauren, and Evan had hung out with Lauren most of Saturday night while they were all at Fish Lips, and then later on that night, Evan would become the last person to see Lauren alive inside the bar. And I do have to point out here that Evan was never once spoken to by any of the DeKalb County law enforcement following Lauren's death. Now, as for the others that night, Aaron and Hannah were just sitting outside the bar watching the band with his 6-month-old German Shepherd emotional support dog, Virginia, that he had brought along. And Chris was cruising the bar looking for ladies before he got a little too drunk, and then he passed out on the houseboat of the new friends they had just met on Friday. Now, before Chris had passed out, it was around 10 to 11 p.m., and Lauren had texted one of her friends back home, Jade, and Lauren had asked Jade to come pick her up because she wasn't having any fun. So Jade then tried to respond back to Lauren by calling her numerous times, but with no response back from Lauren, it then came to the realization that Jade couldn't reach Lauren due to self-service of where Lauren was at the time. Also keep in mind that according to the Without Warning podcast, Lauren had asked 5 other people on Saturday night if she could stay or leave with them. So if Lauren wanted to leave the campsite that night, there must have been a reason or reasons as to why she felt this way. Now, that same night, there were some law enforcement officials that were working the event that weekend as hired security, and 2 of these officers were from White County, Tennessee, who ended up playing very big roles in this case as well. One of the officers was security on the boat docks just outside the bar Fish Lips, and his name is Chris Yarchuk, and the other officer was Ryan Mallinson, and I will talk about him here very shortly. Well, Chris Yarchuk had seen Lauren several times on Saturday night outside the bar, and at one point in the night, Lauren had even spoken to him, which basically ended up being just a small friendly conversation in passing. Then shortly after, Yarchuk says he sees Hannah, Aaron, and Lauren go onto their new friend's houseboat to hang out, and this is also where the group would wake up Chris, who was still passed out, and then the group eventually left back to camp using their canoe around 2:30 a.m. And this would be the last time that the houseboat couple or anyone not at their campsite from that night would ever see Lauren Agee alive ever again. So the group had canoed back to the campsite in the early morning hours of what was now Sunday, July 26, and this is where the biggest mystery of the story would take place. Just hours later, on that Sunday morning, Chris, Hannah, and Aaron said they would wake up at camp, and Hannah noticed that Lauren wasn't there. It had been said at the time that Lauren and Chris were sharing a hammock near a steep cliff, and that Lauren had got up and left in the middle of the night to go meet her ex-boyfriend on a houseboat. Strange thing is, though, Lauren didn't take her cell phone, her shoes, toothbrush, or anything that belonged to her for that matter. And remember, her ex-boyfriend was with his new girlfriend that weekend, and again, he never spoke with Lauren once the entire time. So with no sign of Lauren anywhere, the rest of the group had decided to take the canoe and head back to the docks around 10 a.m. Their new houseboat friends would lift them up to shore, and this is where one of the houseboat people noticed the group's vibe was very different than it had been earlier in the weekend, and Lauren wasn't with them. So she then asked the group where Lauren was, and one of the campers responded with, quote, she had gone back to the bar. Well, what's interesting about this is Lauren's group did not know at this point in time that the houseboat couple were one of the last few people inside the bar before it closed the night before, and the couple doesn't remember ever seeing Lauren around the bar at that time. Now, real quick, the houseboat couple had stated it was a little odd that Hannah herself had never even asked them personally that morning if they had seen Lauren, and I agreed that this was definitely a little odd, being that Lauren and Hannah were supposed friends at the time, and no one had any confirmed idea of where Lauren actually was at this point. Also, I wanted to point out here that law enforcement never once spoke to the houseboat couple from that weekend, and then 2 days after Wakefest had ended is when they would end up finding out about Lauren's death from the news. Now, according to Chris Stout, he had said that after they had got back to the docks that Sunday morning, they waited and waited for Lauren to appear, but she never did. So the group of campers decided to take Chris's boat, and they went off by themselves to Wakefest to party for the afternoon. And numerous witnesses from that day have confirmed that the group was having a great time. So as the afternoon and Wakefest party rolled on, there was still no sign of Lauren, But that didn't deter the rest of the group from having a fun time, even one of them stating on their Instagram accounts, quoted, "Best weekend ever!" exclamation point. So then around 4 p.m. that Sunday afternoon, Chris, Hannah, and Aaron had left the festivities to head back to camp, but there was still no sign of Lauren anywhere. Then right around 4:30 p.m., two fishermen, Dylan and Lynn Blair, who were father and son, would end up discovering something very disturbing while fishing in a small cove located just behind the group's campsite. And this surprising discovery would end up being that of a dark-haired young woman dressed in a black tank top with pink athletic shorts, whose lifeless body was floating in the water. So after stumbling upon this woman's body in the water, one of the Blair boys went back to the docks of the marina and notified a dock worker that weekend, Deanna Elders, and he told her that they had found a child's body floating dead in a nearby cove, and the Blair boys knew she was dead because at the time, the son was an EMT. So Deanna then tells her husband Harry and one of the off-duty police officers from the bar that I spoke about earlier, Ryan Mallinson, about what had just happened. So then the two men would get onto Harry's boat and drive off towards the cove, which is in an area now listed on Google Maps as Coney Hollow. As the men continued driving towards the cove, they would end up passing by both Chris and Aaron, who were in the canoe holding on the back of a houseboat in line of the side of the body. And just as soon as the officer pulled into the cove is right when Chris and Aaron started paddling towards them, screaming, "Is that our friend? Our friend is missing." Which, to popular belief by many, pretty much confirmed that this woman found dead in the cove was 21-year-old Lauren Agee. The boys' sudden appearance startled the fishermen and the off-duty officer who were already in the cove, and Mallinson immediately thought it was very strange that Aaron and Chris just happened to be the first ones on the scene, even though they had never made any attempt to report Lauren missing that day before her body would be discovered. A Tennessee wildlife official then showed up to the scene and took some pictures for evidence, and then both Chris and Aaron were brought up to the boat with the off-duty officer Ryan Mallinson, where he would start to question the two. Also, I just wanted to point out here that the Blair fishermen had said they saw Aaron and his dog canoe back into that same cove area where Lauren's body was found, but I can't seem to confirm the time that this may have happened, but I do speculate it was before her body was discovered, because after Lauren's body was discovered, Aaron's dog Virginia was no longer with him or anywhere in sight. Now, according to Mallinson, both boys seemed scared, stressed, and he already knew something wasn't right, especially after their description of Lauren matched the girl found in the cove, and not once did the two act shocked or even surprised by the discovery of Lauren's body. So, waiting on the boat for local DeKalb County officials to show up to the scene, Mallinson kept talking to the boys on the boat, asking questions, trying to find some helpful information as to why a young lady was just found dead floating in a cove. This is also the same time where Mallinson noticed that Chris seemed very jittery and almost shooken up, and every time Chris spoke on the boat, Aaron would tell him to shut up, "We're not talking without lawyers." Chris is then asked by Mallinson what he was thinking about because he kind of went into a quiet zombie type mode, and Chris replied in what sounded like a joking manner, quote, "I'm thinking about how I can get that gun off your hip and get off this boat," unquote. And for some reason, Chris said this to Mallinson twice that day. Also later on, Chris says to Mallinson out of nowhere that he had sex with Lauren the night before. But hold on, wouldn't this contradict the fact that Chris had already said that Lauren had left the campsite that night to be with her ex-boyfriend? And this would be just the beginning to many stories changing from these other campers about what happened that night, and I will introduce yet another example of this next. So around the same time frame that Mallinson was questioning Aaron and Chris, the other off-duty officer, Chris Yarchuk, started to ask Lauren's childhood friend, Hannah Palmer, some questions about that night before. Now, I'm going to play some audio from that interview for you that can be found on the He Has Nothing to Do With It episode on the Without Warning podcast, but make sure to pay close attention to how Hannah shuffles her story in just a short amount of time.
Where'd y'all sleep at, or where were y'all at?
Up there. At the campground.
So all y'all, and your boyfriend and the dog and that other guy?
Everybody was up there, yeah.
So y'all all went up there together?
Yes.
Okay. And it was at 2 o'clock? Yeah, that was just weird
when she bummed a cigarette from you,
yeah,
that's when we came back here.
Yeah. What's this ex-boyfriend that she run into or whatever?
But she has a new he has a new girlfriend. He
Right.
has nothing to do with it. But
But-
I mean,
One of the guys said that she tried to talk to him, or they were fighting, or he pushed her away, or walked away from her.
well, she said that she went up and had confronted them, but
Yeah.
she's full of drama. So
Okay. How many
But
of
I
y'all
asked the
slept up there
boyfriend
last
today.
night?
4 of us.
So, your boyfriend, the dog, that other cat with the long blonde hair,
Yeah, and her.
and y'all, would you canoe over there?
And she was fine.
y'all
She
went
was
to,
all
but y'all
set
slept
up.
in the tent, all of you together, 4 of you?
No, us two slept in a tent, and her and Chris slept in like a hammock.
Yeah.
And
And which
he
one's
said
Chris?
when he woke up, blonde hair.
The guy that was wearing like the Bieber hair, swishy blonde.
Probably.
Your
yeah.
boyfriend's
'Cause I
got the
was
longer hair, right?
Yeah, you saw me
Yeah.
with him.
Okay.
The fully tatted guy's Chris.
Yeah.
Skinnier,
Yeah.
fully tatted. that's
Tall.
Yeah, it was
So
us
him and
4,
her slept in a what?
a hammock. And he said,
Oh, okay.
I woke up and I woke him up and I said, "Where's Lauren?" And he said, "She got up a while ago." He was like, "But I didn't feel her or anything, but she had gotten up." And I said, "Okay, have you seen her since?" And he said, "No." And I asked how long. He said he wasn't sure because we'd been drinking obviously,
Yeah.
so we were laying in our hammocks and tents and stuff. And
Did you guys go to a houseboat after, or go to walk the dock, or do anything after you left the bar?
yeah,
Just
when we left the bar, when you last saw her, we walked
Yeah.
all the way down, got in the canoe, and went up there.
okay.
And she was fine when we went.
Yeah.
I know she probably went to pee, but she didn't have her shoes, she didn't have her keys, wallet, phone, and she would not leave without that stuff,
Yeah.
Like I know, I've known her since I was 10.
Yeah.
I know she wouldn't leave without that.
Okay.
Last I remember her, she had a white jacket that was still up there. When I went up there, it was still up there, and she had a black tank top and pink shorts.
Okay.
But her jacket thingy was up there.
Okay.
So I think a black tank top and shorts is what she had,
Are you from
unless she
Henderson-
changed before we did that to us.
Are you from Hendersonville also?
We live in the same neighborhood. I don't know if she has pink shorts on.
I have not been over there. Take some deep breaths. We don't know anything yet, So
It's pretty odd. I wouldn't be on this boat if it weren't.
why do you say that?
Because, coincidentally, my friend, I can't find her. And the whole time I'm worried, I'm like, she probably went to pee in the middle of the night and fell. But then I went down and I heard she might have got on a houseboat, so I thought she'd be at Wakefest.
Who said she got on the houseboat?
Evan, he said that she came back and that she said she was going to have to stay on a houseboat
Why would she have to stay there?
because we had canoed back. Or she thought we canoed back. We had actually gone up there, but she had said we canoed back, so I'm going to have to stay on a houseboat.
Now, I didn't follow that. So y'all came back without her, and she
She
said
thought we left her.
here at the campsite.
Yeah. She thought we had left her at the bar.
Okay.
And so I guess Evan said that she said that because we had left her, which we were just up at the car, we came back to the bar, that she's gonna have to stay on a houseboat. So I don't know if that was before or if that was after she last saw me,
We all left together, so.
Yeah, she got up. Yeah, she was up there with us. Yes.
So Hannah first says in this interview that Lauren and the rest of them made it back up to the campsite and Lauren was fine. Then she goes on to say that Lauren was probably using the restroom when she probably fell. Then right after that, she says she finds out on Sunday morning on the docks from Lauren's friend Evan that Lauren had left the bar and got on a houseboat. But what's interesting about this is, later on in Evan's interview I listened to on Without Warning, Evan denies any of this houseboat theory ever happening, and what really makes this conversation with Hannah even more interesting is, Hannah had told Evan that Sunday morning that Lauren had never even made it back to camp from the night before. Also that morning on the docks, Hannah had told Evan, Evan's mother Teresa, and Lauren's ex-boyfriend Clint that Lauren had bruises all over her from hitting the water wrong while the group was cliff jumping earlier that day. But Evan and his mom have said there were no visible bruises on Lauren's body while at the bar on Saturday night. So the big question here is, why was Hannah so conflicted if Lauren came back to camp that night or not? She either did or she didn't. And it would later be concluded that she did in fact return to camp that night. Now getting back to our story, it was now a few hours later and DeKalb County sheriffs and detectives would arrive at the scene, and this is where this entire investigation would pretty much become non-existent. But first, they would fish Lauren's body from the cove using a pole with a hook, then they pulled her body up onto the boat, leaving her lying face down on the side of the boat. Jeremy Taylor, again the lead detective in this case, was on scene and was expected to start an investigation into Lauren's death, but right away he did anything but that. To kind of summarize this part for you, Taylor did not lock down the crime scene up at the campsite. It was not roped off, not taped off, nothing. Taylor also had eventually brought both Chris and Aaron back up to the campsite to take pictures and let them gather their things, which is another way Taylor failed to properly secure a possible crime scene for evidence. Taylor never took any DNA samples from the scene or Lauren's body, especially underneath her fingernails, and later on it was disclosed that a rape kit was never administered as well. They do later find out Lauren had a tampon in after her body had been discovered, but a rape kit should have been automatic in this case, especially since Stout had just told another law enforcement official that he had sex with her the night before, but Taylor wouldn't know that since he never decided to speak with Mallinson about this. Lauren's shoes were brought in for evidence but disappeared somehow. They did not bother taking her sleeping bag in for evidence, and her toothpaste, shorts, and the rest of her clothes were also taken from the scene, but all of that too somehow disappeared as well. The only belongings of Lauren that were ever processed were her purse, necklace, and her phone, and it's been said that text messages on her phone had also been erased from that weekend. Also, Taylor never even took any statements from Chris Yarchuk, Ryan Mallinson, the father and son fishermen, the houseboat couple, or any of the other campers, Chris, Aaron, and Hannah, who were all with Lauren most of the weekend before she would turn up deceased, and in fact, they were allowed to go down to the station that Sunday night to give a voluntary written statement, and then they were free to go, where the three would now have over a week before they would ever have to give any oral statements to the sheriff's office, and leading up to these oral statements, the three did admit to talking to one another. So even after all of these mishaps from the get-go of this investigation, Detective Taylor was right away able to conclude that Lauren's death was going to be ruled an accident, even without a medical report or autopsy report available at the time. And this is where Lauren's case starts to get even a little bit more mind-blowing. So on Sunday, Lauren's body was confirmed deceased and taken to the DeKalb County Hospital. Parents were informed it was an accident, and Detective Taylor even says to them that night, quote, "We may never know what happened to her," unquote, which right away gave Lauren's stepdad Mike very little hope about this investigation in this case. Then a few days later, the county's medical examiner would take a look at Lauren's body and conduct an autopsy report, citing that Lauren had blunt force trauma to the head and her injuries were consistent with a fall. And that was literally it. It was not a thorough report whatsoever, and the medical examiner didn't even annotate the blunt force trauma received to her head, which is crazy to me because this is how the examiner would conclude how Lauren died. Yet for some reason or reasons, they couldn't even put that on the diagram sheet. Also, Jeremy Taylor admitted in a deposition that he never even spoke with the medical examiner at any point during the course of this case. So now we have a start to a piss-poor investigation, a very minimal and not thorough autopsy report. There were no oral statements collected from the other campers Lauren was with that day her body was found. And to top it all off later on, Jeremy Taylor would write up a final report on Lauren's supposed accident, and it was literally 3 paragraphs long. And I honestly think that's being generous. It was another not thorough report in this case, so now I'm going to give you a better second opinion on Lauren's injuries that was given to the Without Warning podcast by private investigator Mark Gillespie, who specializes in forensics. Real quick, I do have to point out though that Gillespie reached his conclusions based on the photos that were previously taken of Lauren's body, not her actual body. He said that Lauren's body was found face down with her arms to her side. Her body was consistent with the beginning of rigor mortis due to the way her body posture was positioned in the water. Her arms were stretched and bent at the elbows, hands turned down towards the face, and often he said they should be clenched due to the beginning stages of rigor mortis. He thinks she was not in the water for a very long time before she was found, and he also thinks the frothy foam that was seen around her body in the cove shows she was subjected to the water, and she may have still been alive at that time. Gillespie also believes the blunt trauma was the kill blow, and the scratches on her back may have come from the pole with a hook that they had used to fish her out of the water. Also, there was a marking on Lauren's chest that has been said by many to have possibly come from the canoe that they were using that weekend, but the canoe could never be found to compare the two, and DeKalb County Sheriff Patrick Ray, hired in 2006, later on says that the marking came from their boat when they fished her out of the water, which, of course, was never documented. Now, real quick on this marking on Lauren, this is the only time you'll hear me say this, but I actually do agree with Sheriff Ray that the marking did come from their boat and not the canoe. There are pictures out there of when law enforcement pulled Lauren out of the water, and they later faced down almost on the side of the boat, not the floor. Well, there was a triangle shape on the boat that was elevated right where Lauren was brought onto the boat, and it matches perfectly, in my opinion, to the mark on Lauren's body. I always thought the mark coming from the canoe seemed a little odd, and if Lauren's body was transported in a canoe, I find it to be a little too risky that someone would just lay her body face down on the front of a canoe and then paddle off. In my opinion, if someone was going to put her body on a canoe, they would have just laid her down on the floor and not risk being seen by anyone else. Last few things about Lauren's body, there was also what looked like to be a bite mark on Lauren's body that was never looked at, and no dental records were ever taken from any of the other campers. There were bruises on her thighs that may have come from someone possibly pinning her down. There was also a hand grip mark on one of her arms that may have come post-mortem, which I think could have possibly come from someone moving her body at some point. There was a mark on her nose that looked like it may have come from a punch, and it's also been said that she showed some throat hemorrhaging, which has been considered a possibility of her being choked. But again, for some reason or reasons, none of these markings or injuries were ever investigated by any DeKalb sheriffs or the medical examiner, and in my opinion, even though some of these injuries could come from a possible fall, they just don't add up, and Lauren's clothes that she was found in looked brand new, showing nothing consistent with a possible fall, no marks, no tears, nothing. And just to add a little mystery to this already crazy case, Lauren's mother did not recognize the clothes Lauren was found in. Sherry has even said she knows everything that's in Lauren's closet. So the questions here are, did Lauren change into someone else's clothes once they all got back to camp? Or did someone change them for her later on? So after the autopsy was conducted and reported, Lauren's family and friends would put Lauren's body to rest on Friday, July 31st, 2015. And Chris Stout, Aaron Lilly, and Hannah Palmer all decided not to attend the funeral, which in my opinion becomes a little telling after learning Chris said that Aaron told him they were not welcome to the funeral, which turns out to not be true, and this is even confirmed by Lauren's mother, Sherry. I also wanted to point out here that Lauren's ex-boyfriend, Clint, who also attended Wakefest, was not welcome to Lauren's funeral, and this decision was made by Lauren's mother, because remember, the theory at this point in time was that Lauren left to go meet Clint after the group said they had got back to camp, but we know now that not to be true, and in the end, knowing he didn't do anything wrong, Clint still went to Lauren's funeral anyways. Then 2 days after the funeral, Lauren's mother caught wind that Ryan Mallinson, the off-duty police officer that was on the boat when Lauren's body was discovered, well, he was trying to get a hold of her because he didn't agree with how Lauren's death was being investigated, and he also didn't agree with the other campers' stories or behavior from that Sunday afternoon. So after hearing what Mallinson had to say about everything, Sherry, Mike, and Brian Agee were committed to finding some answers in their daughter's death. And this is where I will summarize a lot of what they had to go through just to constantly be turned away from any progress in this case. And then I will finish out part 1 with a little bit more about DeKalb County Sheriff Patrick Ray and lead detective Jeremy Taylor. So during this case, Sherry had contacted Detective Taylor numerous times via telephone and email, but what's interesting is Taylor gave Sherry his personal email, not an email linked to the sheriff's office, and Taylor told Sherry that he would look at everything and then put these emails she was sending into the case file. But again, to not many people's surprise in this case, none of those emails were ever saved and they are nowhere to be found, which does seem pretty fitting for the story being that all of Lauren's belongings that were collected from the campsite all seemed to disappear as well. Taylor wouldn't even tell Lauren's parents what belongings they had of Lauren's during this so-called investigation. Also, Sherry was able to get a subpoena for a CD audio of the 911 calls from Sunday, July 26, but when Sherry arrived at the station to pick them up, Those calls were nowhere to be found, and it was blamed on a computer glitch. Also, later on in this case, after getting nowhere, Sherry eventually filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Stout, Lilly, and Palmer in December of 2016, but the two boys would later be dropped from the suit, and then on March 24, 2017, a judge ruled that there was not enough evidence to find Hannah guilty of the wrongful death of Lauren Agee, and the case was thrown out. To me, the big problem I have with this judge's ruling is it feels like he just made his ruling based only on the opinions from his people without really having any proper explanation to any of their conclusions. This is some of the audio used from the Without Warning podcast of Fox 17 News, Sherry, and Judge Young out of Putnam County.
Lauren Agee's family felt they got a raw deal in court in Putnam County. They felt the judge was against them. We don't know about that. But tonight, we know the judge was wrong and the Court of Appeals turned his ruling upside down.
Plaintiff does not have enough evidence.
But her entire case was thrown out by a judge from that area, Circuit Court Judge Jonathan Young. He called all of the witnesses and testimony ridiculous.
The court is extremely disappointed with the quality of testimony in the affidavits provided by the plaintiff in this matter. At best, they did not know what they were talking about, continued to make statements and accusations that they were utterly unqualified to make, and seemed to be just pulled out of the thin air. While the remaining experts' accusations may make for an exciting news broadcast or conspiracy theory, they have no place in a court of law.
He just seemed to be just so much on their side and protective of them, and I don't understand that. Because I think a judge, he should rise above the politics of his community.
And sure enough, when the Lauren Agee case went to appeal, it was the High Court in Nashville that tore apart Judge Young's rulings. Abuse of discretion, applying incorrect legal standard, reaching illogical or unreasonable decision, clearly erroneous assessment of the evidence. The court ruled the Smiths have a clear legal right to sue for wrongful death.
He threw all the evidence out, so he made sure Sherry didn't have a case. It seems to me, once again, that Sherry is the victim of politics. That once again, it's more important to get votes than it is to follow the law and give a ruling based on the law.
And so now Sherry Smith is finally free to pursue the jury trial she has always wanted. Not for money, not to win, just to find out what really happened.
We're going to find out what happened to Lauren. I have faith that we're going to find out what happened to my baby.
So now it goes back to preparing for trial. Remember, all of the defendants in the case have taken the fifth. They're not talking about anything that happened. I'm Dennis Ferrier, Fox 17 News.
Now, Sherry wasn't the only one having trouble in this case. Both of Lauren's dads had a sit-down meeting on the morning of September 23, 2015, with both Sheriff Patrick Ray and Detective Jeremy Taylor to discuss Lauren's case. This meeting will start to make your blood boil, and if you're interested in listening to it, again, it can be found on the Without Warning podcast, and the episode is labeled Proof or Speculation. Well, in this meeting, Detective Taylor basically defends Aaron Lilly's story, saying that it never changed and stayed consistent with other campers' stories from that night. Then Taylor goes on to tell them that polygraphs were not administered to the other campers because the TBI and the Department of Justice wouldn't help him after they reviewed Taylor's case file. Well, excuse my language here, but no shit they probably didn't help him. He basically had nothing in that case file to go off of. A few other things about this meeting that they were disturbing in my opinion. One was Taylor tells Lauren's dad that Chris Stout did not have sex with Lauren because when her body was found, a tampon was in place. Even though we know Chris told Ryan Mallinson that he did have sex with her, and how the hell would Taylor even know anyways? The guy didn't even bother getting a sexual assault kit to find out. In my opinion, women have had sex on their period millions of times, so I find Taylor's logic on this to be just another excuse as to why they didn't conduct this investigation properly. Also, Michael Smith does not believe Lauren ever slept with Chris in that hammock by the cliff, and Lauren even told Cassie that weekend that she had no interest in Chris Stout. Then Sheriff Ray goes on to tell them in this interview that Lauren's injuries were consistent with a fall, and there wasn't enough evidence or information to suspect there was any type of foul play. Quoted, "We can't just chase rumors, and there's a lot of them." Well, in my opinion, this is exactly what Sheriff Ray should have been doing, and I'm not saying all rumors are true by any means, but Ray never pursued anything in this case, let alone any of these rumors, so no wonder they never found any new information. One last thing that Ray said to Lauren's dad in this meeting, and then I will move on. Towards the end of the meeting, Sheriff Ray actually asked the dads, quote, "Do you have any proof that somebody done something or just speculation?" Unquote. And in my opinion, it wasn't just the question he had asked that was surprising, but more so in the way he had asked it, almost coming off as defensive. Now, concluding this segment, again, check out this interview on the Without Warning podcast. And after this meeting was conducted is when Lauren's family decided to contact private investigator and host of Without Warning podcast, Sheila Wysocki. Now, since I've been talking about Detective Taylor and Sheriff Ray, I just want to kind of keep the spotlight on these two men for just a few more moments, and then I will finish up this Part 1 episode. Again, if you're interested in this case, you have to listen to both of these guys' depositions on the Without Warning podcast, and both depositions are 2 to 3 parts, so I will just try to touch on a few things about them. First off, both of these men, when asked about this case, literally knew just about nothing. Starting with Sheriff Ray, he says in one of his depositions that he only spoke with Hannah and Sherry once during the course of this case, speaking with literally no one else involved. And then when asked why, his response to that was, "That's what I have detectives for." Ray also said they rely on the pathologist's word if a sexual assault kit, blood test, or DNA needs to be collected. So basically, the pathologist lets him know if something isn't right, and then the sheriff acts on it. Well, from what I understand, officers are the one that have to ask for the sexual assault kit to be done, not the pathologist. Sheriff Ray didn't even know when the TBI became involved with this case. He couldn't even remember if he ever spoke with someone from the TBI. Ray took 0 steps in furthering this investigation and 0 attempts to seek out any new possible leads. He claims in 2018 he had thoughts of reopening Lauren's case that was quickly closed in 2015, but Ray decided not to because he said if he had to reopen Lauren's case, then he'd have to reopen other people's cases as well, which, in my opinion, is another terrible response from him yet again. Sheriff Ray never once visited the campsite, even though he literally lived down the street from where this all happened. Ray never pushed Taylor to do polygraphs on the other campers, and again, he literally knew nothing about the small amount of evidence that's been presented, and it's honestly very cringy to even hear Ray talk about this case. In conclusion to Sheriff Ray, after listening to his deposition for this case, I still can't even fathom his responses to the questions that were asked of him, and I honestly struggle to really understand why this man is employed at the level he still is. Now, moving on to Taylor for just a quick moment since I've already talked a little bit about him before, and then I will say a quick goodbye for this episode. So as I was doing my research by listening to the depositions and interviews of Detective Taylor, I noticed that he pauses on a response to one of the questions being asked. And I'm just going to play a quick audio clip from one of the parts of his deposition found on Without Warning, which will then lead me into the next episode where a huge revelation is made and this whole case just gets a little bit crazier.
Did you take any polygraphs in connection with this case?
I tried to.
Tell me about that.
I went to Miss Smith, told her what I was thinking about doing. We talked to her throughout this and let her know what was going on with the investigation. Told her that I was going to ask them to take a polygraph.
When you say them, who do you mean?
Sherry Smith. I can't remember if her husband was there, or her ex-husband, Lauren's dad, was there. And I know her husband was there. I'm wanting to think they was all 3 there.
You weren't planning to give them polygraphs?
No.
So I'm asking, who were you telling them you were going to polygraph?
The 4. Her friends that was up there with her.
Okay.
Now, if you noticed at the end of the audio clip, Detective Taylor is asked by the interviewer who Taylor was going to polygraph, and his response was, the 4, followed by her friends. Well, we all know by this point that there were only 4 people who were at the campsite that night, but now one of them has mysteriously passed. So wouldn't that only make 3 people? So why did Detective Taylor say 4? Well, the answer to that question is, about 3 years after Lauren's death, her family, thanks to the Without Warning podcast, later found out that there was a fifth person who was camping with Lauren and the rest of the group that entire weekend. And for some reason, this person was kept in the dark for the first part of this case. But it was later on confirmed that he was in fact camping with the rest of them. And on the next episode, I will reveal that person and talk a lot more about that. So in conclusion to Lauren's part 1 episode, it definitely feels like everything in this case so far is very suspicious, stemming from bad police work all the way to blackballing the victim's family, which has been for years now. There wasn't even a crime scene or a proper investigation into Lauren's case, and in my opinion, it only gets worse from here. So on that note, I want to thank everyone that continues to tune into my podcast. Please do check out Lauren Agee's case. I can't say it enough, it will literally blow your mind. And thank you to everyone who has subscribed to my TikTok and YouTube channel as well. And my Lauren Agee Part 2 episode will be published next week, so please make sure to check back to hear the ending to this appalling case. And as always, my friendly reminder to everyone, love everyone but trust no one. I'm your host Drue V, and you've just heard another episode of True Crime. What's up everyone, and welcome back to another episode of True Crime. I'm your host Drue V, and for these next 2 episodes I will be covering the unbelievable and very questionable case of 21-year-old Lauren Agee. In late July of 2015, Lauren had decided to attend a weekend event called Wakefest at Center Hill Lake in DeKalb County, Tennessee. Wakefest is a big wakeboard festival that included an estimate of around 600 boats and a couple thousand